Now over to the UK, where former London Mayor Boris Johnson has been chosen by his party and will become Britain's next Prime Minister. Johnson will replace Theresa May, who was forced to resign amid Brexit turmoil. RT's Sara Montes joins me with the details. Sara, lots of leadership changes around the world in the EU. Now we have the official person who's going to be replacing Theresa May. But we're going to feel this outside of just not what's going on in the UK. We're going to feel it other places.
That's right, Scotty. So Boris Johnson will officially take office this Wednesday when Theresa May formally resigns from the post. Now, earlier today, during a speech, Johnson was very energized and promised to deliver Brexit and unite the country.
I say to all the doubters, dude, we are going to energize the country. We're going to get Brexit done on October the 31st. We're going to take advantage of all the opportunities that it will bring in a new spirit of can-do. And we are once again going to believe in ourselves and what we can achieve. And like some slumbering giant, we are going to rise and ping off the guy ropes of self-doubt and negativity. With better education, better infrastructure, more police, fantastic full fibre broadband sprouting in every household, we are going to unite this amazing country and we are going to take it forward.
But what's gone under the radar is the European Union's top executive who clinched her selection. Just last week, Germany's Ursula Von der Leyen was selected to lead the European Union Commission as president. Now, she'll be the first woman to hold the EU's most prestigious position and follow the current president, Jean-Claude Juncker's term, which ends October 31st. Now, with these new faces that are taking over, now what does that mean for the EU? Von der Leyen is coming into the position with some pretty ambitious goals, including an attempt to maintain an orderly Brexit, one that benefits both sides.
I am convinced that it is very important the way we have the Brexit, because it is not an end of something. It determines the beginning of the future relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union. And we want to be partners. They are our neighbor. We have common interests. So I'll put a lot of emphasis that we will have, if it's necessary, a Brexit in a good way, knowing that we have a common future.
With von der Leyen in power, there's pressure building on Brexit from both sides of the equation, but it really remains unclear just how it will play out. And with Boris Johnson, he could run into the same problem as his predecessor, Theresa May, who was unable to strike a deal. Now, many members of his own Conservative Party, a crucial majority of all members of Parliament, do not believe the UK should crash out of the EU without a deal in place. So could more countries follow suit and, like the UK, have their own internal exit? Well, just 3 years ago, the French spoke of a Frexit. The Dutch far-right leader wanted a vote on Nexit, and some other politicians predicted a Swexit, a checkout, and an Italy. But after seeing the long-enduring Brexit, these countries are reconsidering this decision. Scottie, with a new leader in office for the EU, these countries hope to limit EU power of their country's budget making and bring their own ideals to Brussels.
Sara, as I was listening to Boris Johnson in his acceptance speech, I had to go, that had to be the first time in history I heard the words dude and the other comments he made. He was obviously very excited. I think he's going to give President Trump a run for his money on, though, who can actually do the better soundbite that'll hit the headlines.
Well, he is, and he's been very much a populist and really kind of like Trump, been compared to Trump in more ways than one, but he seemed very energetic, very excited. He used the word energy in that speech, so we'll see how far he can bring the UK and if he actually achieves a Brexit deal. Just
when you think the reality show could not get any more interesting, it always does. Thank you, Sara.
You're welcome.
To go further in depth, we turn to Afshin Rattansi, host of RT's Going Underground. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it has been a wild few months, weeks, days, 24 hours. So did the UK just put into power the British version of President Trump? And I'm not just referencing his hair.
Oh, no, because, I mean, President Trump would never make allegations against certain parts of national society. He wouldn't criticize them. He wouldn't lie, for instance. And President Trump would no doubt not seek to polarize opinion to such an extent that people would start resigning en masse from his cabinet. Hang on, actually, obviously, Scottie, there are a huge number of political similarities. But on the other hand, on social policy, he's actually very much more liberal than anything that Trump has been in his present incarnation. They are similar. They are similar in their inscrutability because they change their views all the time. So media and journalists are so prone to taking quotes from either of these politicians. And, of course, whether it be Boris Johnson or whether it be President Trump, either of them can say, well, I don't say that anymore.
Oh, well, that's the interesting part, because I think both of them at some point are going to start competing against each other for the headlines. They're going to realize, wait a minute, we're reading from the same book at this point. But a lot of people have made Boris out to be very conservative. And as you point out, socially, he's not. Is that really the truth, though? Is he as conservative as most of his adversaries are making him out to be?
Well, he did take part in David Cameron's government, which was had such critical austerity policies. The critics said that they basically ripped up British civil society by destroying public life as we knew it post-war, and Boris Johnson went along with that. There is a huge class element here. There's an infamous picture of Boris Johnson with David Cameron and other members who may be chosen in the next 24 hours as part of his new cabinet in black suits with wing collars and white tie at Oxford at a notorious drinking society. There is all that. There's a massive class element to all of this, where I suppose President Trump, on the other hand, was part of many different milieu. I mean, some people say gangsters, after all. But it should be said, as regards their relationship, the Washington-London relationship, and perhaps these quotes will be going around on your more liberal, so-called liberal media, that he said, Boris Johnson said, I think Donald Trump is clearly out of his mind. What he's doing is playing the game of terrorists and those who seek to divide us. He said that in 2015 about Donald Trump. He has a string of quotations in 2015 where he criticizes Donald Trump to the point of saying he is unfit to be president. That is certainly not the President Trump or Boris Johnson relationship that we see today, because, of course, Trump was quick to say, it's going to be a great premiership on this side of the pond.
Well, and that's the one thing we've learned. I mean, he basically just earned himself a place in President Trump's cabinet, because I think every person that's a part of the Trump administration at some point said words that were kind of like what Boris Johnson said in 2015. We knew he wasn't really a fan of him. But at the same time, I'm already seeing, I feel like it's deja vu, Groundhog Day, whatever you want to call it. Because from day one, President Trump was plagued with the argument that he didn't win the popular vote in the U.S. and threats of impeachment even before his inauguration. Now you've got Boris Johnson facing kind of the same wrath, as you have Jeremy Corbyn saying the Labour Party is going to table a motion of no confidence when appropriate to do so, and Not My PM trending already. So is this typical drama for British politics? I mean, House of Cards was based off, well, the first one came from the British, or is this different from the history of this sort of conversation and this sort of discordment going on within the British Parliament?
As far as I know, it's not as violent as the original House of Cards series, which, as you say, was filmed here about British politics. But when Theresa May goes to see the Queen to tender the resignation, then I suppose one shouldn't be talking about Boris Johnson's premiership over already, because he's not quite Prime Minister. You're right, though. And rather like impeachment, he faces a mass rebellion from his own side, because he envisages a no-deal Brexit. People close to him say he is doing this as a bargaining chip with the European Union over policy, and this is a much better strategy with the European Union. But in Parliament itself, which many outside it see as not really that representative of the country, we haven't had an election since Parliament went into a kind of crisis where nothing could get through Parliament as regards the Brexit debate. Parliamentarians seem to already be organising a centrist opposition to Donald Trump, with people saying that those pro-Tony Blairites, together with the Liberal Democrats who used to be part of David Cameron's policies, austerity policies, together with those who want to remain, who are in the Tory benches, can all ally and destroy Boris Johnson even before it has begun. But I'm hearing that some Tories are saying, let's wait until the autumn, although we're in a massive time-limited situation here as regards British politics, because October the 31st is the deadline for Britain to leave the European Union.
Oh, we are definitely going to talk about that in our second part that will be airing at our 5 o'clock show about Brexit and how this is going to change the UK on the international scene and the policies. But before I get to that, I also want to ask you, though, you mentioned about the people that surround themselves. You talked about who Boris was going to put in his cabinet. Recently, the scandal surrounded the UK ambassador and the leaks, and now you have the resignation, which leaves a spot to be filled. One that President Trump has already tweeted out he'd like to see his friend Nigel Farage have. Do you think the new prime minister will grant President Trump's wish?
Well, there is no doubt that Nigel Farage, friend of President Trump, has been a towering figure in British politics in recent years, perhaps one of the big figures of the since the war, one could argue here, although he is hated by mainstream media and elites in this country for his seeming success in the Brexit referendum, which was opposed by all sections of elite society in this country. Boris Johnson got a lot of criticism because he didn't seem to come out for the British ambassador in Washington. However, it will be such a big ask of him to put Nigel Farage in Washington, I would suggest. The rumours here are that his old Oxford, or is it Eton, one of these posh places, colleagues, David Cameron, the former British Prime Minister, could be an ambassador to Washington. But who knows? In the age of Trump, do ambassadors matter as much, or do personal phone calls matter more than ambassadors and diplomats?
It depends whether or not they praise him on Twitter, I guess, is what it comes down to. Now for part 2 of our interview with RT's Afshin Rattansi. This time we dig deeper into Brexit and how Boris Johnson has to take on the rising tensions with Iran.
Boris Johnson won this campaign to become leader of the Conservative Party on less than 1% of the British electorate's vote. It may seem a bit bizarre to Americans watching that can be called democracy. But if you trace his views on Brexit, they've changed massively. And his father, who's appeared on my show quite a bit, keen environmentalist, very pro the European Union. He was on the European Commission. Boris Johnson, always pro-Europe. Then, at a crucial moment around the referendum time, he said he wanted to leave. And in the few hours after he won the competition to be leader of the Conservative Party and therefore Prime Minister of Britain, he appointed the head of the Scotch Whisky Association as his chief advisor on Brexit, as one can imagine. I'm not sure if your viewers drink it, but Scotch, they depend on markets in Europe. So is that signs of some kind of U-turn? People aren't ever sure what Boris Johnson's opinions are. We mustn't forget that as a journalist, he was fired for lying about Europe. He regrets that, he says these days. But you can't really tell what his feelings are and how the force of circumstance could change even fundamental views about Brexit. But he's campaigned to say we will leave on October the 31st, no deal or with some kind of deal, which certainly from Brussels doesn't seem to be coming.
Well, and then you also have to look at the effect that's also going to have on the rest of the UK right now. You already have the Scottish saying, we're out. We're going to take another vote and possibly separate. How is the reaction to the other countries that, of Great Britain to this new Boris Johnson election? Are we hearing, what are the Irish saying? What are the Scotch saying? And we're not just talking about the whiskey on this case.
Well, in Ireland, it poses perhaps the greatest crisis to the United Kingdom. It was Britain's oldest colony, 800 years, and many people seeing the whole Brexit situation as finally the 6 counties of the north of Ireland, presumably American Catholics will be happy, will be reunited indeed with the South, because parts of the Good Friday Agreement mandate a need for a poll if circumstances change, and circumstances would change if there was a border between Southern and Northern Ireland. As for Scotland, Scotland has indicated, and Scottish politicians that are landsliding it with independence votes, certainly in the Edinburgh Parliament, they've indicated they want to vote. So this would and could very well presage the end of the United Kingdom.
Which, that's historical, no doubt. There's been several historical moments on this. That being said, I have to also bring in what's going on in the Middle East and Iran. Recently, it seems like Iran has stepped up their pressure on the UK. Do you think they're taking advantage of this period of leadership change and what's going on to add pressure on the UK to basically stand up either against the United States or unite the United States?
I should say I was a journalist who lived in Tehran, and from my knowledge, they wouldn't really be seeking to use the political crisis here in London for political capital in that way. In fact, from Tehran, they just say, why did the Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt, who competed with Boris Johnson to become Prime Minister in the next few hours, why did he seize this oil tanker in the first place when even the Spanish didn't want it seized in the mouth of the Mediterranean near Gibraltar? Many people thinking, was that Jeremy Hunt trying to play political games for his leadership to beat Boris Johnson? Who knows? But Boris Johnson himself came under a lot of pressure because he infamously said that a British prisoner in a Tehran jail was teaching media when the line from her family was that she was only on holiday. Some people now saying, was that him being loose with what he'd been told at private conversations by British intelligence? So Britain is in a bind over the whole Iranian situation, not least, of course, because President Trump said we won't be using any U.S. Navy ships to protect British shipping in the Straits of Hormuz. But it has to be said, the Iranians are threatening the destruction of Dubai and the United Arab Emirates and God knows what else as regards Trump's postures on Iran, and they're even saying the Straits of Hormuz isn't the whole point about that crisis. Britain will find itself in a very strange position, not knowing whether to turn to Europe, which they back on the JCPOA, or your good president, who seems to have catalyzed the whole crisis.
Well, that's the thing
that we're facing.
And that's what gets me right now. We have about a minute on this, and so I want to just get one quick question for you. Is Boris going to be more bullish against Iran, or is he going to try to de-escalate UK's position on this, regardless of what the U.S. decides to do with the policies on it? Is he going to say that this is not good for our country to continue on this path, what looks like to be for war?
Boris Johnson, always keen in the race to become Prime Minister to emphasize that he is the grandson of a Muslim, and presumably that's going to be one of the cards he's going to have to play if he's going to talk to Tehran. How seriously he can actually act in foreign policy, let alone home policy, depends on his whole civil service structures, diplomatic structures, and obviously he will have one eye very much on Washington. So I know there are changes in Washington being rumored, even John Bolton. Right. Presumably Boris Johnson will have to calibrate any kind of policy in those geopolitical terms rather than a sudden trip to Tehran to actually find a diplomatic solution.
Well, let's just hope that Boris' children can spell a little bit better than President Trump's can, doesn't cause any international crisis. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll have you back on very soon.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.